Hi everyone. In this short video, we're going to look at one of the key questions we could be asked to think about in our GCSE exam about Kenilworth. And this question focuses on the physical remains of the castle and what they can tell us about the past. But importantly, it also asks us to think about how do the remains create questions for historians. And so a key thought for this video is physical remains can create as many questions as answers for a historian. Okay, and we're going to explore and think about this idea in this short video. So here is the question that makes up part of the exam criteria. How have the physical remains of Kenilworth prompted questions about the past, and how have historians framed these as valid historical inquiries? Now, this is quite long-winded and a confusing way of putting the question, so let's break it down a bit. First of all, it's crucial that we're clear what physical remains mean. Okay, so this is basically what we can still see of Kenilworth, the buildings and the ruins that are there today. The first part of the question here means what kind of questions arise when looking at the physical remains. Okay, so when you're looking at those physical remains, what questions come up? And then the second part means how does a historian build on the initial questions that come to mind when you're just kind of walking around the castle? How does a historian build on these to form a historical inquiry which can tell us something really important? So let's explore these two parts to the question a bit further then. Right, here we can see Kenilworth, main part of Kenilworth on a beautiful sunny day. Hopefully you'll be able to spot some kind of key parts to it which we're starting to learn. So you'll be able to see the keep, which is the kind of the main building there at the back on the left-hand side, the gardens for Elizabeth on the left. You'll see the Great Hall in the middle there with its huge windows. So as you're walking around this, questions are prompted. Questions crop up as you're walking around and looking at these different buildings. Things like, who built this and when? Why? Did this work? What actually happened here? Why are some bits destroyed and others aren't? Basically, we're thinking about all the immediate questions that come to mind when you're looking at the ruins. That's the first part of this question, okay? So how do these ruins, when you're looking at them, what kind of questions do they make us think about? But then we can build on this and develop the questions a bit. For example, we might start thinking something like this. The remains show that Kenilworth is larger and more impressive than most castles. So we might think, well, why was Kenilworth chosen to be so important? We might think this. There are remains that look like they're of very different ages. How long was Kenilworth lived in? So we can see that we start to build on these initial questions and kind of, take them a bit further and think specifically about Kenilworth and then about maybe its place in the wider picture. To return to a key idea, physical remains don't give clear answers, but they do give clues. And the remains at Kenilworth, because they are so huge, impressive, and many parts of the castle are so well preserved for their age, they've given us fascinating clues about English history. And this can take us on to the second part of our question today. How have historians framed these as historical inquiries? So what we mean by this is, how does a historian take the initial questions we've looked at so far and develop these into a meaningful inquiry that would build kind of wider historical knowledge? So one way they do this is to combine physical remains with other knowledge. For example, when looking at the huge outer wall and the defensive structures that King John built, a historian could use these to build a historical inquiry about how serious the threats were to King John. Then it could think about, did strengthening the castle actually help him at all? Also, historians can use physical remains to build a wider historical inquiry. For example, looking at the buildings of Kenilworth and seeing that they became more palatial over time, a historian could build an inquiry around what this tells us about England at the time. Why and how did it become maybe more peaceful? Finally, what can help us with this question is to think about historical concepts, something we come across in other parts of our GCSE. So, a valid historical inquiry will be built around one or more key concept. So, let's recap what these are. We've got causation, that means why did something happen? We've got consequence, what the results of an event were. Change and continuity, how did things change over time? Significance, how important something was. And finally, diversity. So that could mean how typical Kenilworth is and the events that happened here compared to other places. So, what we have to do is try and think about how these concepts could be linked to the physical remains that you've learnt about. And here's the challenge I want you to do. You can pause the video and I want you to try to think of a valid historical inquiry for each of those concepts. Okay, so there are 5 there. These need to be linked to a part of the physical remains. Okay, so this is a bit of a challenge, and bits of it might be quite difficult. I want you to give it a really good go. Send me your answers, and we can look over them together. I've given you an example here. So here's an example of a valid historical inquiry around the concept of consequence. So it says, in the physical remains, we can see that parts of the castle were destroyed. We know that this happened during the English Civil War. Did this destruction of castles have the desired impact of weakening the royalists? Okay, so that historical inquiry is built around consequence. We want to know what were the results of something that happened. So the thing that happened was the destruction of part of the castle. We want to know the consequence of that. Did it actually help them? Did it help the parliamentarians when they were fighting against the royalists? So that's one example. You'll need to spend a bit of time thinking about this and working on it. I want you to write 5 historical inquiries. If you're really stuck, send me a comment and questions, and we'll go through it and work on it together. When you're done, then you're done with this part of the lesson. Thanks, everyone.